So first, what this talk is not going to be about, so don't think you're going to go away from this having a comprehensive understanding of the PDPA. Don't think anyone's got the appetite for that this evening. Instead, I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to talk about why we have data protection laws in the first place, some of the fundamental problems I think which exist with them. I think it's okay for a lawyer to disagree with laws. And then I'm going to talk about what's happening, some of the trends in Asia, looking at some of the myths, so kind of common misconceptions about data in Asia. And then I'll put the PDPA in the context of that without going through it in much detail. So first, data.
Do you mind using the mic?
Oh, sorry. Is that better? Can you hear me now? I hate mics.
Oh, it's all right.
So data, that's what it's all about. That's what we're all here to talk about. And I think the key to this image is to remind you that all data law, or data protection law, is only relevant when you're talking about data relating back to an individual. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize here is that actually data protection laws have only really developed since the 1970s, so they're relatively new, and they developed out of a bit of a paranoia with the rise in personal computing. So a lot of it is directly linked to the use of different devices, and that's why it came about. And in the context of data law, it really is incredibly complicated, a bit too complicated in many instances. And it often gets very confused. So data gets linked to privacy, and then privacy gets linked to Snowden and the NSA and state surveillance, and it gets linked to computers and internet and everything. So it covers so many different things. And all of these different elements, unfortunately, have developed at different times and lead through a very confusing spectrum. And they're all going in different directions as well. So you see kind of developments in defamation law, which everyone worries about with the rise of social media. And you see cloud leading to more concerns about transfers of personal data. But it's not all bad. I think, there's some really good stuff happening with data and law as well. So the good stuff, I've seen a real increase in government open data initiatives. So actually thinking, okay, we've got a load of law and restrictions around data, but it is still possible to share data as we're doing here and as Prudential is doing without running contrary to this. So still a lot of sharing of data and trying to work on what can be done. But I think actually there's a real role for self-regulation as well, which hasn't really been taken up by industry in the way I think it needs to be. I mean, the industry needs to lead in terms of setting legislation or procedures which actually work for businesses. And I think in that gap of industry not doing too much, we've run into a lot of problems. So the cookies rules in Europe, which I'm sure you've all heard about, this crazy law which means that every time you use a cookie, you have to consent to it, really came about because industry didn't respond and say, this is crazy. It kind of almost came in through the back door. But there is some stuff happening, particularly around interactive advertising, but I really think we need to see more. Because otherwise, I think the data laws that we saw developed in the 1970s, as all the technology changes, they stay pretty stagnant, really. And if you look at Europe, there's a current overhaul of the European regime, which is actually where the data laws started, and it's just getting a bit crazier there. So instead of kind of taking out stuff, they're just putting more and more rules in. So more paperwork you have to do, more bureaucracy, up with the fines, more consent, and kind of more into it, rather than thinking about what's really important. So these are the problems, really, I think. And I really put it down to one big problem with data protection law. It all still comes back to the consumer and puts a lot of onus on the consumer. So essentially, data protection laws, like the PDPA, like all those around the world, say, as long as you tell the consumer, you tell the individual what you're going to do with their data, and you get their consent to it, you can do it. But that presupposes that the consumer understands and actually can be bothered to read all those different consent things that they get. So a Microsoft exec actually calculated that if he read all the terms and conditions, privacy policies, consents, notices, tick boxes that he looks at in a year from everything he uses, about 76 days of his life just reading them all. And that was a couple of years ago. I think it's probably gone up since. And Which, a consumer organisation, did a study as well. And they kind of did a mock exam. And they used even the execs and lawyers who had written some of these things and said, what does this mean? What does it mean? You know, these simple questions about what actual consents people were giving. And everybody failed. So that was quite a good sign. But I think it's a real problem, isn't it? Because all the legislation I see coming through in Asia and that we'll look at later still relies upon consent. And I think it becomes, in my view, obviously it's important that consumers know, but it's becoming really, really impractical for them to understand. If you look at the number of complaints that Facebook has got on its terms, and the number of times they've had to change how they do their consent and the different ways, it's still complex. It's still really, really detailed. So what I'd really like to see, I think, is a move away from kind of putting the onus on the consumer and saying, look, let's just tell people that they can't do bad stuff with data. So much like pharmaceutical companies, no one actually reads those slips that you get inside the pill box, but you kind of rely on a sense that the industry is regulated. It's not going to do anything bad, and if it does, you've got some kind of comeback. But anyway, we're stuck with that for the moment, but I think that's where I'd like to see the innovation in data law around that problem. So let's talk about Asia and those myths that I mentioned at the beginning. So these are common things that I found even before I moved to Asia that people said about data protection laws in Asia. So myth number one was, oh well, privacy doesn't really mean anything in Asia. You know, Asians don't worry about privacy. It's not an issue. So you often get this kind of typical, oh, where's that gone? Was it me? Obviously didn't like that picture.
Half a minute.
Yeah, no problem. Six. Yeah. So this is the kind of typical preconception that you often have, that, you know, privacy is just not a big deal in Asia in the same way. And there's almost this sense that you've got a difference between kind of individualistic countries and cultures and more kind of collectivist approach, which of course isn't really the case. I think the thing is, each country is different around the world, and data protection and where data laws develop really do depend on those differences. It doesn't mean that privacy isn't something people worry about, but they worry about it in different ways. So one international survey of what individuals in different countries looked at kind of did a survey across Asia, and in Malaysia, for example, 80% of Malaysians who took the survey said their main concern was how companies use their personal data. And if you took that to Thailand, it's about 4%. Because in Thailand, the main concern was state surveillance. But I don't think you can assume from that that Malaysians only care about companies and the Thais only care about state surveillance. But it's very different, often, you know, down to what has happened in a particular year that leads to how people think about things. And then the rapid change really leads to even further difficulties. So it's nuance, but it's not that it's not an issue at all. So, two, a lot of people think that data protection laws really are just a kind of European thing. Europe has a very bad name for data protection, and everyone thinks, oh, why would you want to set up in Europe? They've got crazy data laws. But actually, there's plenty of data laws here in Asia. Here you can see in the green, these are ones where there were comprehensive data protection laws, and in the yellow, where it isn't a data protection law, but you've got lots of other protection. So in Thailand, there's stuff through the constitution, for example. I think what's quite telling about this is, firstly, pretty much everywhere's got something, but you can see that Southeast Asia tends to be a little bit behind some of the others. Obviously Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, very recent new laws, but Southeast Asia tends not to have these comprehensive data protection laws. And I think really it's been very piecemeal again, and you often see certain events leading to the development of little laws rather than one overriding piece of legislation. So an example would be in the Philippines, in 2008, there was this national scandal because in a hospital, a surgeon was caught on CCTV doing a rather delicate operation on an individual, and it was filmed on CCTV, and it went viral, and the surgeons were just laughing at this individual while they were performing the surgery. So that then led to national outcry and the development of a very specific hospital CCTV Data Act. So very, very specific. And you actually see a lot of that happening around Asia. So it's responding to a particular concern from people, which happens over time. But really, why we're seeing all these new comprehensive data laws is about economics. It's because there are now so many countries around the world which have data protection laws that if you don't, it's no longer a good thing. So it used to be, probably about 15 years ago, clients used to come to me and say, where can we set up our data-rich business which doesn't have data laws? That would be really good. And so you'd say, well, you don't want to go here, you don't want to go here. This place doesn't really have very many. Now it's very different. So most clients will say, where has strong data laws? Because that's where I want to set up, because that shows my customers and my clients that I care. And if I can fulfill those high requirements, then actually that's better for my business. And it's been a real turnaround. And of course in Asia, there's a response to that. Singapore has a very new Data Protection Act, as you know, coming into force in July. And it's exactly responding to that need that if you're going to attract data-rich companies, you now have to have that regulation in force. And particularly as data is transferred around the world, if you're the one country who doesn't have it, then actually it can really, really badly affect you economically. So a lot of it's economic reasons. I'm not going to go through that, but that's to show you some of the key new laws which we've seen just developing around the region. That is just the new stuff. Many other countries have been doing a lot more. The one I would pick out there to worry about is South Korea. It does stand out, because in South Korea they have a rather different approach. And actually many would say that it's probably the most strict regime in terms of data protection and enforcement than many other. Which gets me on to the last myth. So there's all these laws, but they're all economically led. You don't need to worry about them, you can just ignore them. So obviously, this is the kind of thing lawyers tend to point out. They'll say, jail, 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 fines, $1 million, really bad, be careful. And it's true, if you look at most of this legislation, somewhere in it, it'll have big penalties, because otherwise, why bring in a law unless you can't tell people, and enforce it? In reality, if you look around the world at what happens with enforcement, it's not that it doesn't happen, it's just that it happens in relation to some specific things which really matter. Most of the jail, the massive fines, is down to theft of data, real negligence in relation to data, and particularly on the fines front, it's security. So it's the banks which don't have proper security processes, and they just, someone goes home with a laptop and it's left on the MRT and it has loads of client data. That's where you get big fines. But often it's combined with the regulator as well. So in most parts of the world, the financial services regulator actually slaps more fines on companies than the data commissions. So I'm not saying you don't need to worry about it, I'm just saying I think you need to put it in context. I think there's far too much scaremongering about data, usually because lawyers want to make some money out of it. And you have to put it in that context of it is practical and it's trying to be proactive and it's economically motivated. So let's go on to Singapore, which I think is a prime example of an act which, yes, follows the precedent, which I think is flawed and won't work and is impractical and we don't like it. However, it's actually relatively pragmatic in terms of not going so far on additional consent requirements, not having too much bureaucracy, and not having it's just not too draconian, it's practical. So a really quick overview. As you know, it's in two parts. So you've got the do not call, which was in already, and then you've got the general data protection stuff, which comes into force in July. And you've got this new commission set up, so it's a new regulatory body. And I would say so far, I've only got positive things to say about the commission, as far as I've seen them. So they seem to be very practical, they listen. The whole point of this is not about stifling innovation, stopping the kind of things which we all want to do, but just saying, let's be sensible about it. I think the biggest problem at the moment is it's quite a high-level piece of legislation, and there's not much of the guidance around it to say what you need to do. So I think the main problem is just there are gaps which leads to uncertainty, rather than the fact that the actual provisions are crazy or over the top or silly. But let's just go back to the beginning. So I said, you only need to worry about this stuff if it relates back to an individual. So it's this thing called personal data. Well, what do we mean by personal data? Let's do a quick test just to give a feel for when you need to worry about these. So a name. Do you think that's personal data? Yes. Probably. So, yeah, it's going to be one of those, I'm afraid. So, yeah, probably. A name you would think automatically leads back to an individual, but many are incredibly common, aren't they? So the standard example, in the UK is, what if it's Joe Bloggs? What if it's John Smith? Is that really personal data? It could be, but it could be actually hundreds of thousands of people you just don't know. So often it would need to be combined with something else. Email address, Twitter username, social media username?
Yes.
Probably. So again, it depends. So in most parts of the world, we don't have the real name requirement, which was heavily debated in China. So it would depend often what the particular handle you're using or social media name is. Obviously, some social media channels now do try and require you to personally identify yourself, but not all. So it would depend who can see that information, and can they pair it with something else to really link it back to you as an individual. Information about employees. No one wants to answer now because they know it's going to be probably, don't they? Actually, the answer is yes on this one, so it's more straightforward. Yeah, there's a bit of confusion as to whether employees are in or out of the Act here. They're in. There are some exemptions and things, but even if you're not using consumer data, you still need to worry about the PDPA. Work phone number? Depends. So a work phone number, so if I gave you my business card, or the fact that my phone number is on my website, and you contacted me about work, then that's fine. You can use it. However, the fact of my work email address does not mean I can be spammed with loads of marketing messages. So there's a bit of and this is why I say it's actually quite common sense, the way the Act has been designed, but it's not hard and fast and clear either side. There's a bit of a kind of judgment call that you need to apply. And usually the test I apply is, would I be irritated by this? And then that's usually quite a good standard. What about information about a marketing campaign? Depends, doesn't it, on that one. So what does the data show? Can you relate it back to individuals? So that might mean in some person's hand, if you're using an analytics company to do the analysis for you around the campaign, they may not have been given the personal information, but for you, you may be able to link it back. So a good example is, with IP addresses, for example, in the hands of me, all your IP addresses without knowing who you are, it's not going to be personal data, because I'm not likely to link it back to you. But to Singtel, because they've got all your account details, it's going to be personal data, because they can link it back. But it does make it quite complex. Again, I think you just got to think practically, but for a lot of you who are doing data sharing campaigns and thinking about that, it really is that data in and of itself may not seem to be personal data, but who can link it back to other data? is an important question. On the other hand, with some of these, you can see that a lot of data that you think, oh gosh, yes, that's caught, I have to be really careful. No, you can often, it isn't caught at all, or there are things that you can do to make it anonymous and mean that it's not caught. And you don't need to worry about it at all. It's always good. Quickly, some best practices, just so you feel you go away knowing something about the PDPA. So yes, it's the get consent again, that's the key for most things. And then, you know, if you look through all these things, they're quite sensible, aren't they? I mean, if you're designing what someone should do in relation to personal data, those are the kind of things you'd put down. So only use them for the purposes that the person gave them to you for, telling people what you're going to do, letting people access and correct it, making sure it's accurate and complete, and security, which I think is probably the biggest issue to think about. Not keeping it longer than is needed, and this issue of transferring outside of Singapore, that this is one issue that, again, a lot of people get confused about because there's not the detail from the Commission yet on it. But of course it can't be the case that Singapore is not going to let any personal data outside of Singapore. That would be crazy. That just wouldn't work. It would be contrary to the business purposes. But you do need to be careful about it. And an additional complication in Singapore, you have to have a data protection officer appointed and make sure that anyone you give data to looks after it and does all those things. So I mean, it could really be boiled down into those 10 points, really. It's not so bad. So some closing thoughts. Just wanted to emphasise that this is not something to be really worried about. I think it's flawed, yes, but that's a bigger issue. But really it's not intended to make business more difficult or to change the way you do business. There are important things you need to do, yes, but I think a lot of them are common sense. And they're usually good for business anyway. So there's no reason to stop innovating. I think is the key thing. It should not be a barrier. Another thing to think about, but not a barrier. Thank you.
Great. We've got time for some questions, right? Cool. I'll ask a question. So you're basically pointing out to us it's about being sensible, common sense, not getting tied up in knots over something. So, I mean, I don't know about, I'll just take a quick sample from the room, but I mean, I found that very useful because that gave me some reassurance about what we're doing. And the message was, you know, as long as you're responsible, you behave appropriately, you can get a lot done. That's correct.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, how can we help companies become more comfortable? Is it more workshops, capacity building sessions? Is it more prototyping weekends? Is it more competitions like this, just generating use cases? And what can we do as an industry, as a group of people, to encourage more understanding, openness, use of this data to innovate?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. As I said, I think to get these things right, industry needs to lead it because industry actually understands its market far better than anyone else, better than a regulator. I think the problem at the moment is that it's seen as a chore and something that people need to engage a lawyer just to do an audit and then put in place a load of documents, and then people think they're fine, tick the box, move on. But it is a bit of a cultural shift, I think, in thinking about these things. And the more we talk about it and don't just think of it as something scary and something that is a financial expense basically to do, then I think, yeah, that's very helpful because then it becomes normalised. And hopefully, my big hope is you actually end up having solutions to people's genuine concern about personal data, which aren't as unworkable as this in the long term.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Okay, cool. Just say your name as well.
Hi, I'm Jasper. I have a question about one of the best practices you shared, which was the fact that data should not be stored longer than needed. How does that tie in with, a lot of businesses nowadays rely on data and monetize data basically that is not always needed. So how do those two reconcile?
Yeah, it really it's one of those things that it seems common sense, but the problem is there's only that statement in the Act and the detail isn't there. So an independent assessment by each person needs to be made on what is sensible. actually, for most companies, there usually are other reasons that they need to keep data. Common ones are accounting rules, contract limitation periods, and particular requirements of their individual regulator, which mean that actually some of the data storage requirements are very long, and longer than actually, from a business perspective, you think you need them for. But yeah, there is that assessment, and I think it's not that you suddenly say, no personal data, but it's that, again, thinking, do I need all this data? Are there bits I could anonymise? Are there bits I no longer need? And what is the need, really? Is it purely commercial? And did I explain to the consumer? Again, it's back to that test of the consumer. Would a consumer expect 15 years on me to still have this data? Sometimes, yes, they may well do. Particularly, I think, in the context of free services. But it's hard. Yeah, it's one of those things. It's judgment. And that's why they're talking about it and seeing what works for different industries and sharing that knowledge, I think, would be really helpful.
Any other questions? Okay. Just come over here. There you go. You say your name.
Hi, I am Kancham. My question is about social media. Typically, when we say social media monitoring or listening, we can gather a lot of data about social media. And always there's a confusion between us and customer that is it private data? Is there any data privacy relevant to this? If yes, in what sense?
Yeah, it's a good question because actually it really does vary around the world. And there's actually quite a difference between the US approach that actually Singapore's followed on this compared to Europe. So in Europe, they would say data, even if it's publicly available, so even if it's on my Facebook page that I've made available to the world, then you can't use it just because something's publicly available. In the US, it's completely the opposite. It's like, if you make it available, fair game to a certain extent, depending on different sectoral rules. And Singapore has followed more of that approach, actually. But then it depends, doesn't it, on the settings as well. So, you know, if you've used the settings of your account to set it to a limited group, then it's not publicly available. It's only to those limited people. But if you've decided that you're going to add your boss, you know, as a friend, then, you know, you've kind of made that decision. So it's putting some of the onus back on the consumer. And I think that's one thing the Commission is definitely going to do, is more of that kind of education to consumers about the use of their personal data and what to do with it. But you've got more ability to use the data. So it means particularly for employers doing checks, which is very common, and checking on social media. That would be pretty tricky in many parts of Europe, doing that. But actually here, if it's publicly available, genuinely publicly available, it's publicly available, it can be used.
We heard about Intel casing case. I don't know if you might be aware about it, Intel casing Facebook issue.
Yeah, I mean, it really does vary in different parts of the world. And again, you know, there may be legal reasons why you're fine to do it, but does it make sense for you? You know, is it going to annoy your customers? Is it going to annoy your employees? Because I think with many of these things in the world of marketing, there are so many things you could do, but you choose not to do, because ultimately it's not worth it because you're annoying the people you want to work with.
Great, so I'm just going to move on to the next question. Thank you so much for that. So questions from the back.
Hi, I'm Zul. My question is, what are the considerations and provisions in regards to where and how the data is being used and where it's actually stored? Because now with cloud services and stuff like that, the data is most probably stored somewhere else, possibly in a different country entirely. So if you're doing business in Singapore and data is stored somewhere else, in the US, for example, what are the considerations?
Yeah, this is where, from a PDPA perspective at the moment, there's not enough detail around how they're going to allow transfers of data to be made. So you can only draw kind of sense from many of the suggestions and what works in other countries as well. So it's believed at the moment that entering into a contract with, say you're using, you know, you've got your servers provided by a third party in the US, your contract with them should address the transfer of data. Essentially, the whole point is to make sure that wherever you're transferring it to, provides the same kind of adequacy rules as you would have in Singapore. And this is exactly why so many countries are developing data laws, because they want to be seen as adequate. You know, Singapore wants to be on the white list of countries that Europe has, which says, fine, yeah, you can send to Singapore, no problem. But we're not quite at that stage yet. So at the moment, yeah, there's a bit of uncertainty. I think practically, if you're using a third party, such as, you know, an AWS service, for example, you ask them, you know, they're the guys who are providing the service to you, and you say, what are you doing to make sure that I'm not in breach of the PDPA? You put the onus back on them. There are usually ways around it, and of course cloud isn't as simple as, oh, that means data's anywhere in the world at any one time. There are so many different types of cloud service. You know, a bank, for example, because it has MAS requirements as well, they would make sure that if they're using a cloud provider, actually they do know where the data is located. So it's a cloud service, yes, but they actually have some transparency as to where it is. But yeah, it's the big area which needs to be cleared up. Are there going to be whitelist countries? Is it going to be a model contract? How's it going to work in practice? At the moment, the best solution is contracts, really, and making that assessment carefully.
Great, thank you. The last question of the evening from over here.
Hi, Elle. My name is Matt. I have a question with regard to whether there's a view in kind of the prevailing jurisdiction, not necessarily in Singapore, but just in general, as to whether or not a data set can go from a point where it is not personally, it doesn't allow you to personally identify anyone, but it grows to an extent where you can actually infer who someone is. And I think a good example on this would be browser fingerprinting, right? Which is a way of taking many small pieces of data, which individually don't really mean much, but you put them together, and in aggregate, they do allow you to uniquely identify a device in this case, right? What is the view on that particular problem?
I mean, you're absolutely right, it is a real problem, and it's not that something starts off as personal data and then is always personal data, or vice versa, something starts as not personal data and can never become personal data. It's very fluid, and it depends by that increase in information in the hands of a person who can then link it back to the individual. So if that information is with lots of different people, those different companies or people may not be able to link it back. But if one company has all that information, then yes, they may well get to a point where suddenly they can do more. I mean, it is why it becomes such a problem with the data laws generally, because the volumes and obviously the expertise of data analytics now means that you can find out so much from stuff which seems seemingly to be anonymous. I mean, Pat will know this better than I, but there are many analysts at universities in the States who do just that. So they'll go out onto the web, they'll find information relating to cinema goers, for example, and they end up, when you combine it with other information, forming huge personal profiles about people, because they just keep digging away until they can make that link. So, in a way, I think it almost encourages people to be a bit dumb, deliberately, to try not to go too much further, because as soon as you get to that point of making the link, you're almost at the point of no return. It can be dangerous, which I think is problematic. But yeah, you're absolutely right, that can definitely happen.
Great, thank you very much. It's been brilliant. Really appreciate it. Round of applause, please.